Oh, you poor things.
The thing about living alone in the mountains is you get used to the silence. Sarah Mitchell had spent the last 8 years in that cabin outside Cascade Ridge, Oregon, and she thought she'd seen everything the forest could throw at her. Harsh winters, wandering bears, the occasional confused hiker who'd strayed too far from the trail. She was 63 years old, tough as the pine trees that surrounded her property, and she'd chosen this life specifically because she was done with people and their complications. But what happened that February night? That changed everything she thought she knew about what lived in those woods. See, Sarah found something that shouldn't exist. 2 of them, actually. And when she made the choice to help instead of hiding behind her locked door, she set off a chain of events that would bring her face to face with an entire community that humanity had written off as legend. What followed wasn't just an encounter, it was a message. And the crazy part, she wasn't the first person in Cascade Ridge to receive it. I know what you're thinking. Bigfoot? Really? But here's the thing about legends. Sometimes they exist because there's truth buried underneath all the campfire stories and grainy photographs. Sarah Mitchell found that truth huddled against her cabin wall, dying in the snow, and what she discovered about the creatures in those mountains. It's still being covered up by authorities who don't want the public to know what's really out there. This is that story. Now, before we dive in, do me a favor. If you're into these kinds of mysterious, edge-of-your-seat true stories about things that shouldn't exist, hit that subscribe button. We're building a community of people who want the real stories, not the sanitized versions. And if you want to make sure you don't miss the next video, smash that notification bell. Trust me, what's coming next in this series will blow your mind. Plus, drop a comment below and tell me, would you have done what Sarah did? Because I'm honestly not sure I would have had the guts. Alright, let's get into it. February 14th, Valentine's Day. Most people were thinking about flowers and chocolate. Sarah Mitchell was thinking about her dwindling woodpile and whether the storm rolling in would last 3 days or 5. The weather report out of Portland had been calling for heavy snow since Tuesday, and by Thursday afternoon, they'd been proven right. Snow had been falling since morning, and now, at just past 9 p.m., it was coming down so hard she couldn't see the tree line 50 feet from her porch. Sarah sat in her rocking chair, close enough to the wood stove that the heat made her face flush. She'd changed into her thermal underwear hours ago, layered a flannel shirt over that, and wrapped herself in the wool shawl her daughter had sent for Christmas 3 years back. The last Christmas before the cancer took her. Sarah tried not to think about that too much anymore. But winters made it hard. Winters made everything hard. The cabin creaked under the weight of the wind. Ice pelted the windows like someone throwing handfuls of gravel. The radio on the shelf played static-filled classic rock from the station out of Bend, but she kept it on anyway because total silence could mess with your head after a while. Even after 8 years, she added another log to the fire, watching the flames lick up the sides of the dry pine. The woodpile outside was getting low. She'd need to snowshoe out to the shed tomorrow if this storm broke, drag back a few loads on the sled. Hard work for a woman her age, but that was the deal when you chose to live this far from town. Nobody to rely on but yourself. The wind shifted, howling through the gap under the door. Sarah made a mental note to stuff a towel there before bed. Then, underneath the storm's roar, she heard something else. A sound that didn't belong. She straightened in her chair, head cocked to the side. The radio buzzed. The fire snapped. The wind kept up its assault on the cabin walls. But there it was again, faint, high-pitched, almost swallowed by the storm, but definitely there. Crying. Sarah's first thought was wind playing tricks. The mountains could do that sometimes, create sounds that seemed almost human. But this wasn't random. It had pattern, rhythm, the desperate quality of something in distress. She stood up, her knees protesting after sitting too long. The sound came again, clearer now that she was on her feet. Not from inside the cabin, from outside, close to the cabin. "What the hell?" she muttered, moving toward the window. She wiped frost from the glass with her sleeve, but all she could see was white, snow falling so thick it looked solid, like someone had hung a sheet in front of her window. The crying continued, weak, faltering, very definitely not the wind. Sarah's heart rate picked up. Her mind went through possibilities. An injured animal. But what animal sounded like that? A person? Jesus! If someone was lost out there in this storm, they wouldn't last an hour. The temperature had dropped below 20 degrees, and with the wind chill, it felt closer to zero. She grabbed her heavy coat from the hook by the door, shoved her feet into her insulated boots. Her hand hesitated on the door handle. Every instinct told her that going outside in this storm was stupid, dangerous, the kind of decision that got people killed. But that sound, that crying, "Damn it," Sarah said, and opened the door. The wind hit her like a physical thing, shoving her back a step. Snow flew into her face, into her eyes, making her squint. The cold was immediate and vicious, finding every gap in her clothing. She pulled her hood up and stepped onto the porch, holding the railing for support as the wind tried to knock her over. "Hello?" Her voice disappeared into the storm. She tried again, louder. "Is someone out there?" The crying came from her right, toward the north side of the cabin. Sarah descended the 3 porch steps carefully. The snow had already drifted a good 2 feet deep and made her way along the cabin wall. The wind cut at her exposed face. Her eyes watered, but the sound was getting closer. Then she saw them, 2 shapes, small, huddled together against the cabin's foundation, partially buried in snow. Sarah's breath caught. For one horrible second, she thought they were children. Lost hikers, maybe. Though what kind of idiot brought kids out here in February? But as she got closer, as her eyes adjusted to the darkness and blowing snow, she realized these weren't children. They were covered in hair. Thick, matted fur that was crusted with ice and snow. Their bodies were small, maybe 3 feet tall, but their proportions were wrong. Arms too long, shoulders too broad. And their faces. Oh God, their faces. Sarah froze 3 feet away, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The faces were a mix of human and something else. Broad, flat features, wide-set eyes that caught what little light spilled from her cabin window. No fur on their faces, just bare skin that looked gray in the darkness. Their mouths were open, making those crying sounds that had brought her out here. One of them reached toward her with a hand, not a paw, a hand that had 5 distinct fingers. What they? Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. These were babies, infants of something that shouldn't exist, and they were dying. The logical part of her brain screamed to get back inside, bar the door, pretend she'd never seen this. But the part of her that had raised 2 children, that had nursed her daughter through chemo until there was nothing left to nurse, that part wouldn't let her walk away. These were babies. Babies dying in the snow. Sarah bent down. The infants, she couldn't think of them as anything else, watched her with those huge dark eyes, terrified, exhausted. One made a weak sound and tried to burrow further into the snow, as if that would somehow save it. "It's okay," Sarah heard herself say, though she had no idea if it was okay or if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. "I've got you." She scooped up the first one. It was heavier than she expected, its fur soaked through and frozen. The body was ice cold beneath the wet hair. The infant made a sound not quite human, not quite animal, and clutched at her coat with surprising strength. The second infant took more effort. It was barely moving, its breathing shallow and rapid. Sarah got her arms under it and lifted, grunting with the effort. Together, the 2 of them probably weighed 60 or 70 pounds. The walk back to the porch felt like a mile. The wind pushed against her, trying to knock her over. Snow pelted her face. Her arms burned from the weight. But she made it to the steps, then to the door, and finally inside, where the warmth hit her like a wall. Sarah kicked the door shut behind her and stood there, breathing hard, her arms full of two creatures that weren't supposed to exist. The infants had gone silent. They stared at the fire, at the light, at the impossible warmth of the cabin interior. Then they started shivering, not small tremors, violent, whole body shakes that Sarah could feel through their soaked fur. She carried them to the hearth and set them down on the braided rug her granddaughter had made. They collapsed immediately, their small chests heaving. Sarah grabbed the wool blankets from her bed, both of them, and wrapped the infants carefully, tucking the edges in to trap heat. For a long moment, she just knelt there, watching them. They were real, solid. She could smell them, a musky, wild scent, mixed with wet fur and something else, something organic and earthy. Their breathing was ragged, but steady. Their eyes, Jesus, their eyes were so human it made her chest tight. One of them reached out from beneath the blanket, that too large hand grasping weakly at the air. Sarah hesitated only a second before taking it. The fingers, 5 of them, with the same joints and opposable thumb as a human hand wrapped around hers. The infant's grip was strong, desperate. "You're okay now," Sarah said quietly. "You're safe." She had no idea if that was true. She had no idea what these things were, or where they'd come from, or why they'd been dying outside her cabin. But she knew they needed warmth, and they probably needed food and water. Sarah went to her small kitchen and found the loaf of bread she'd baked 2 days ago. She tore off chunks, soaked them in warm water to soften them, and brought them back to the fire. The infants watched her approach with those huge eyes, wary but curious. "Here." She held out a piece of the bread. "Try this." The larger of the two sniffed it first. Then, slowly, it took the bread from her hand and put it in its mouth. It chewed carefully, as if testing whether this was food or poison. After a moment, it swallowed and reached for more. The second infant was weaker, but hunger drove it to eat as well. Sarah fed them small pieces, alternating between the two, and gave them sips of water from her tin cup. They drank clumsily, water dribbling down their chins, but they drank. As the fire warmed them and food filled their bellies, their shivering gradually subsided. They leaned against each other, wrapped in blankets, and watched Sarah with expressions that looked almost grateful. She sat back on her heels, her own adrenaline starting to fade, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Outside, the storm continued its assault. Inside, 2 impossible creatures dozed by her fire. Sarah looked at them for a long time. Part of her still wanted to believe this was hypothermia-induced hallucination. Except she could smell them. She could see them breathing, and when she touched their hands, they'd been undeniably, impossibly real. "What the hell am I going to do with you two?" she whispered. Neither infant answered. They just slept, their small bodies curled together, looking for all the world like human children who'd found safety after a nightmare. But they weren't human children, and Sarah had a terrible feeling that by bringing them inside, she'd just opened a door that was going to be damn hard to close. She added another log to the fire and settled into her rocking chair, knowing sleep wasn't going to come easy tonight. Every few minutes, she glanced at the creatures on her floor, half expecting them to vanish or transform into something else. But they stayed solid, real. The radio played on, staticky and distant. The storm howled, and Sarah Mitchell sat guard over 2 beings that couldn't exist, wondering what the hell she'd just gotten herself into. Morning came slowly, the storm finally losing its fury sometime around dawn. Sarah hadn't slept. She dozed maybe 20 minutes here and there, but mostly she'd watched the infants breathe and listened to the wind die down. The cabin was quiet now except for the fire's crackle and the soft sounds of the creatures sleeping. Sarah's back ached from sitting in the chair all night, and her eyes felt gritty with fatigue. She needed coffee. Hell, she needed about 10 cups of coffee, and maybe a strong drink to go with them. She stood carefully, joints protesting, and made her way to the kitchen. The coffee was instant, not great, but it did the job. She heated water on the stove and mixed it with the grounds, the familiar ritual helping her feel almost normal. Through the kitchen window, she could see the storm had left behind maybe 2.5 feet of new snow. The sun was just starting to break through the clouds, sending long shadows across the white landscape. Beautiful, peaceful. Then she noticed the shadows moving. Sarah set her coffee down and moved closer to the window. She wiped away the condensation with her palm and looked out. There were figures among the trees. Tall figures. Very tall. Oh shit, Sarah breathed. They were standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 60 feet from her cabin. At first, she thought it was tricks of the light, shadows cast by the trees. But as she watched, one of them moved. A deliberate step forward. Sarah's hands started to shake. There were dozens of them. She counted quickly, 10, 15, 20. No, more than that. They formed a loose semicircle around her property, all of them facing the cabin. They were massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, their bodies covered in dark fur that looked almost black against the snow. Steam rose from them in the cold morning air, proof they were breathing, living things. They weren't moving, weren't making noise. They just stood there, watching. Sarah's mind went immediately to the infants by her fire. These weren't random creatures. These were family, a tribe, and they'd come for their young. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed danger. She was alone, miles from the nearest neighbor, with a cabin full of the most vulnerable members of a species that could probably tear her apart without breaking a sweat. She stepped back from the window, then forced herself to breathe. Panic wouldn't help. She needed to think. The infants were still asleep by the fire, oblivious to what waited outside. They looked peaceful, safe, but they weren't hers. They'd never been hers. And now their people had come. Sarah looked at the door. She could stay inside, bar it, wait them out. Maybe they'd leave. Maybe they'd forget about the babies and just go. Or maybe they'd come through the door and take what was theirs by force. Thing is, Sarah had spent 8 years alone in these mountains, learning one critical lesson. Running from problems just made them worse. Whatever was about to happen, hiding wouldn't change it. She pulled on her coat, checked that her boots were laced tight, and put her hand on the door latch. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she steadied them with sheer willpower. "Here goes nothing," she muttered, and opened the door. The cold hit her first. Then the sight. They were closer than she'd thought. The nearest ones stood maybe 40 feet away, close enough that she could see the details of their faces. Broad foreheads, deep-set eyes, noses that were wider and flatter than human noses. Their mouths were closed, but she could see the intelligence in their expressions, the awareness, and right at the front, directly facing her cabin, stood one that was clearly the leader. She was certain he was enormous. Had to be 8.5 feet tall, with shoulders that looked like they could support a small car. His fur was darker than the others, almost black, with patches of gray around his face that suggested age. His eyes, though, Jesus, his eyes. They were locked on Sarah with an intensity that made her knees weak. Sarah stood on her porch, one hand still on the door frame, and met that gaze. Every fiber of her being wanted to run back inside, slam the door, hide under her bed like a scared child, but she forced herself to stay put. The leader didn't move. None of them moved. They just watched her. The silence was suffocating. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could hear the crunch of snow settling, could hear absolutely nothing from the massive creatures that surrounded her property. It was like they were waiting, expecting something. Sarah swallowed hard. Her voice, when it came out, sounded steadier than she felt. "I know why you're here." The leader's eyes narrowed slightly. Not aggressive, just listening. "They're safe," Sarah continued. "I found them last night. They were dying." She gestured back toward her cabin. "I brought them inside, warmed them up, fed them. They're okay." No response. Just that unblinking stare from dozens of eyes. Sarah's hands were shaking again. She shoved them in her pockets. "Look, I'm not trying to keep them. They're your people. I get it. I couldn't leave them out there in the storm. You understand?" She had no idea if they understood. For all she knew, they didn't comprehend a word of English, but she kept talking anyway, because silence felt more dangerous. "I'm going to get them now," Sarah said slowly. "I'm going to bring them out to you, okay?" The leader's head tilted slightly. Maybe acknowledgement, maybe just confusion. Sarah couldn't tell. She turned back into the cabin, her legs feeling like rubber. The infants were awake now, sitting up in their blankets, looking toward the door with wide eyes. They made soft sounds, not quite words, but definitely communication. They knew. Somehow, they knew their family was out there. Sarah approached them carefully. "Hey, your people are here. It's time to go home." One of them made a mewling sound and reached for her. The gesture was so human, so childlike, that Sarah felt her throat tighten. She'd spent less than 12 hours with these creatures, but damn if she didn't feel protective of them. "Come on," she said gently, bending down. "Let's get you outside." She picked up the larger one first, blanket and all. The infant clutched at her coat, making anxious sounds. Sarah shushed it softly. "It's okay, I promise. Your mama's out there." The second infant was lighter, easier to carry. Together they made a substantial armload, but Sarah managed. She walked back to the door, took one more deep breath, and stepped outside. The reaction was immediate. The infants began crying not in distress, but in recognition. Their small hands reached toward the assembled tribe, fingers grasping at air. The sounds they made were high-pitched and urgent, and the tribe responded. The silence broke with low rumbles, deep sounds that Sarah felt in her chest rather than heard. They weren't threatening growls. They were something else. Recognition, relief, communication she couldn't possibly interpret. Two figures stepped forward from the group. Females, Sarah guessed, though she wasn't entirely sure how she could tell. They were slightly smaller than the leader, their fur a lighter shade of brown. They moved with careful, deliberate steps, never taking their eyes off Sarah. Sarah descended the porch steps slowly, her boots crunching in the snow. Her heart was trying to beat its way out of her chest. The females stopped about 10 feet away, waiting. "Here," Sarah said, though her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Take them." She knelt in the snow, setting the infants down gently. Immediately, they scrambled toward the females, moving faster than Sarah had thought possible. The larger one made it first, launching itself at one of the females who caught it effortlessly and pulled it close. The second followed, and the other female scooped it up with hands that were massive, but surprisingly gentle. The infants buried their faces in the female's fur, making sounds that were unmistakably sounds of comfort, of home. Sarah stayed on her knees in the snow, watching. The females examined the infants carefully, running their hands over small bodies, checking for injuries. One of them met Sarah's eyes and made a sound low, rumbling, but not aggressive. "You're welcome," Sarah whispered. She started to rise, ready to back away, to let them leave. But then the leader stepped forward. He was even more massive up close. Sarah had to crane her neck to look at his face. He stopped about 6 feet away, close enough that she could smell him, a wild, musky scent that made something primal in her brain scream predator. But he didn't move to attack. He just looked at her. Sarah froze. This was it. Either he was going to acknowledge what she'd done, or he was going to kill her for touching their young. Hell, she wouldn't even blame him if he did. She was human. Humans had been hunting, killing, and denying the existence of his kind for who knew how long. But the leader did something unexpected. He reached down and picked up something from the snow. A branch, about 1.5 feet long, stripped of bark, smoothed at the ends. It looked deliberate, crafted. He stepped closer, Sarah's breath caught, and placed the branch in the snow at her feet. Then he straightened, made a sound in his chest that vibrated through the cold air, and took a step back. The gesture was unmistakable. A gift, or maybe a token, recognition of debt. Sarah looked down at the branch, then back up at the leader. "Thank you," she managed. He held her gaze for another long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he nodded, actually nodded. The human gesture looked strange on his massive frame, but the meaning was clear. He turned and signaled to the tribe with a low grunt. The females holding the infants moved first, disappearing into the tree line. The others followed in pairs and small groups, melting into the forest like they'd never been there at all. The leader went last. He paused at the edge of Sarah's clearing, looked back once, and then he too vanished into the trees. Sarah knelt in the snow, alone, staring at the spot where dozens of impossible creatures had just stood. The only proof they'd been there at all were the tracks, massive footprints pressed deep into the snow, leading away into the forest, and the branch, the carefully crafted branch, lying in the snow at her feet. She picked it up with trembling hands. It was smooth, polished almost. Someone had spent time on this. It meant something. Sarah looked at the trees for a long time, but nothing moved. They were gone. She stood on shaky legs and walked back to her cabin, the branch clutched in both hands. Inside, the fire still burned. The blankets she'd wrapped around the infants lay in a heap by the hearth. The cabin looked exactly the same as it had 12 hours ago, but everything had changed. Sarah set the branch carefully on her mantle, above the fire. She poured herself another cup of terrible instant coffee and sat in her rocking chair, staring at the flames. She'd spent 8 years in these mountains, thinking she understood them, thinking she knew what kind of creatures lived in these woods. Bears, cougars, elk, the usual suspects. She'd been wrong. Dead wrong. And now she had proof, solid, undeniable proof, that something else lived out there. Something intelligent, something that understood gratitude and communication and gift-giving. Sarah sipped her coffee, her hands finally steady. She should probably tell someone. The authorities. Scientists. Someone who could document this, study it, prove to the world that these creatures existed. But even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't. The tribe had trusted her. They'd come to her cabin, vulnerable, desperate to retrieve their young. They could have attacked, could have destroyed her property, hurt her, killed her. Instead, they'd waited, they'd shown restraint, and then they'd given her a gift. That was trust. And Sarah wasn't about to betray it. She finished her coffee and set the cup aside. Outside, the sun was fully up now, painting the snow brilliant white. It looked peaceful, normal, like nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Sarah closed her eyes and allowed herself, finally, to sleep. But the branch stayed on the mantle, a reminder, a promise, and a secret she'd carry to her grave. Here's the thing about secrets, though. They have a way of getting out. And what Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that she wasn't the first person in Cascade Ridge to have an encounter with the tribe. She was just the first to survive it with a gift. 3 days passed before Sarah ventured more than 50 feet from her cabin. The storm had left its mark drifts piled against the north wall, the path to her shed completely buried, her woodpile reduced to a few frozen logs that would need to be dug out. Normal mountain winter stuff. Except every time she looked at the tree line, she remembered those massive shapes standing in the shadows. She spent those 3 days doing normal things, chopping wood, fixing the shutter on the south window that had come loose in the storm, organizing her pantry. Radio played in the background, mostly static with occasional bursts of music or news from the world beyond the mountains. She tried not to think about the tribe, about the infants, about the branch on her mantle. But of course, she thought about little else. On the 4th day, she decided she needed supplies. Her flour was running low, and she was down to her last tin of coffee. The nearest store was Peterson's General in downtown Cascade Ridge, about 12 miles down the mountain on a road that the county plows usually hit within 48 hours of a storm. Sarah loaded her old Jeep, a 1997 Cherokee, with 200,000 miles and counting, and headed down the mountain. The drive took longer than usual. Snow still covered parts of the road, and she had to navigate around downed branches and one small tree that had given up and fallen across her path. But she made it. Cascade Ridge wasn't much of a town. Population maybe 800 in the winter. Double that in summer when tourists came through on their way to the National Forest. Main Street consisted of Peterson's General, a gas station, a diner called Betty's that served breakfast all day, the sheriff's office, and a bar called the Timber Lodge that Sarah had never set foot in. A few houses scattered around, and that was pretty much it. She parked in front of Peterson's and grabbed her shopping list. The store was the kind of place that tried to be everything for everybody. Groceries, hardware, hunting supplies, tourist trinkets. Old man Peterson had run it for 40 years, and his daughter Emma ran it now, after he'd passed last spring. Emma was behind the counter when Sarah walked in, ringing up supplies for Jake Henderson, who ran a logging operation about 6 miles west. Jake was in his mid-40s, built like a tree himself, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending most of your life outdoors. "Sarah," Emma called out, "thought you might have frozen to death up there." "That storm was brutal. Takes more than snow to kill me," Sarah replied, grabbing a basket. "How'd town fare?" "Lost power for about 36 hours. Few trees came down on Maple Street, crushed Derek Wilson's shed. But otherwise, not too bad." Emma finished with Jake's transaction and handed him his receipt. "You staying warm up there all alone?" "Fire and blankets," Sarah said, moving toward the flower aisle. "Same as always." Jake turned to leave, then paused. "Hey Sarah, you see anything weird during the storm?" Sarah's hand froze on a bag of flour. She forced herself to relax, to keep her voice casual. "Weird how?" "I don't know," Jake scratched his beard. "Few of my guys reported strange tracks in the snow out by the north section. Big tracks. Said they were too big for any bear they'd ever seen." Emma laughed. "You telling me your guys are seeing Bigfoot now? Jesus, Jake, you need to stop letting them drink on the job." "I'm serious." Jake's expression was anything but amused. "I saw the tracks myself. Whatever made them was heavy prints went down a good 6 inches, even in packed snow. And the stride length? Had to be something tall. Real tall." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "Could have been a moose." "Didn't walk like a moose," Jake said. "Walked on 2 legs." The store went quiet for a moment. Emma's smile faded. "You're actually serious?" "Dead serious." Jake looked between them. "Look, I know how it sounds, but I've been working these woods for 23 years. I know what bear tracks look like. I know moose, elk, deer. These weren't any of those. So what are you saying?" Emma's tone had shifted from amused to uncomfortable. "I'm saying there's something in those woods we don't understand." Jake grabbed his supplies and headed for the door. "Just be careful out there, Sarah. You're pretty isolated up at your place." "I'll keep my eyes open," Sarah said quietly. After Jake left, Emma shook her head. "He's been watching too many of those cryptid shows on cable. Next, he'll be telling us aliens are building crop circles in the clear-cuts." Sarah didn't respond. She finished her shopping in silence, paid, and loaded everything into the Jeep. But before heading home, she made a decision. She drove 3 blocks down Main Street and pulled up in front of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Marcus Thompson had held the position for 12 years. He was a decent man, mid-50s, with the kind of calm demeanor that came from dealing with small-town problems, where the most exciting thing that happened was usually drunk teenagers, joyriding, or tourists getting lost on hiking trails. His office was small, just him and 2 deputies, but they did their job well enough. Marcus looked up when Sarah walked in. "Sarah Mitchell. Don't think I've seen you in town since." "When? October." "Something like that." Sarah sat in the chair across from his desk. "You got a minute? For you? Always." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "What's on your mind?" Sarah hesitated. She'd promised herself she wouldn't tell anyone. But Jake's comment about the tracks had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. If the logging crews were seeing signs of the tribe, if they were getting too close. "I ran into Jake Henderson at Peterson's," she said carefully. "He mentioned finding some unusual tracks up by the north section." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He talked to you about that. Said his crew found them after the storm. Big tracks, walking on 2 legs. Jake's been calling me about those tracks for 2 days now, Marcus said. Wants me to come out and investigate. Says his guys are spooked. Are you going to? Sarah, you've lived in these mountains long enough to know how stories spread. Someone sees bear tracks and decides they're Bigfoot. Then everyone starts seeing Bigfoot. Pretty soon, we've got tourists trampling through the woods with cameras, scaring off actual wildlife, and generally making my life difficult. So you're not taking it seriously. Marcus sighed. I'm taking Jake seriously. He's not usually the type to get worked up over nothing, but I've got to balance that against the reality of the situation. We get reports like this, maybe twice a year. Usually it's nothing, and when it's not nothing, something shifted in Marcus's expression. He studied Sarah for a long moment, then glanced at his office door to make sure it was closed. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. You ever hear about what happened up near Eagle Point back in '98? Sarah shook her head. Before your time here, there was a researcher, woman from Portland, doing a study on elk populations. She was camped up near Eagle Point for about 3 weeks. One day, she radioed down that she'd found something. Tracks, evidence of a large primate in the area. Said she was going to document it. What happened? She disappeared. We found her camp a week later. All her equipment was there. Food, clothes, research notes. Even her truck was parked right where she'd left it. But she was gone. Sarah felt cold. You think something took her? I think she went looking for something she shouldn't have been looking for. Marcus leaned forward. We searched for 2 weeks. Brought in dogs, helicopters, volunteers from 3 counties. Never found a trace. It was like she just walked into the woods and vanished. You think she found what she was looking for? I think the woods keep their secrets, Marcus said carefully. And people who go digging too hard sometimes become secrets themselves. Sarah absorbed that. Did you ever find her? No. Case is still technically open, but... He shrugged. After 15 years, we're not actively investigating anymore. They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Marcus spoke again. Why are you asking about this, Sarah? You see something up at your place. This was her moment. She could tell him everything. About the infants, the tribe, the branch on her mantle. But looking at Marcus's face, she realized he already knew. Maybe not the specifics, but he knew enough to be warning her off. Just curious, Sarah said, standing. Jake's story got me thinking. Sarah. Marcus's voice stopped her at the door. Whatever you might have seen or heard during that storm, keep it to yourself. There are things in these mountains that are better left alone. For everyone's safety. She met his eyes. Is that official advice, Sheriff? That's friendly advice from someone who's lived here long enough to know when to let sleeping dogs lie. Sarah nodded and left the office. But Marcus's story stuck with her on the drive home. A researcher who'd gone looking for evidence of the tribe and disappeared. How many others? How many people over the years had gotten too close and paid the price? The tribe had been gentle with her. They'd shown restraint, gratitude, even trust. But Sarah wasn't naive. She'd seen how massive they were, how easily they could have hurt her. The only reason she was alive was because she'd helped their young, because she'd acted with compassion instead of fear or curiosity. But what about people who came looking to capture one? To prove they existed? To exploit them? Sarah pulled into her driveway and sat in the Jeep for a moment, staring at her cabin. The branch was still on the mantle inside. A gift, a connection to something ancient and hidden, and a responsibility she hadn't asked for but now carried anyway. She grabbed her groceries and headed inside. The cabin was cold. She'd let the fire die down too much, so she spent the next hour rebuilding it and putting away her supplies. Coffee, flour, canned goods. The mundane routine of mountain living, but her eyes kept drifting to the branch and to the tree line beyond her window. Night fell early this time of year. By 4:30, the sun was touching the western peaks, painting the snow orange and pink. By 5, darkness had settled over the forest like a blanket. Sarah made herself dinner, canned soup and bread, and tried to read by lamplight. But concentration wouldn't come. Her mind kept returning to Jake's tracks, Marcus's warning, the researcher who'd disappeared. Around 7, she heard something outside. Not a loud sound, just a faint crack, like a branch breaking. Sarah set down her book and listened. The cabin was silent, except for the fire's crackle. She waited. There. Again, another crack, closer this time. Sarah stood and moved to the window. She couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond the small circle of light cast by her porch lamp. But something was out there. She could feel it, that prickling awareness on the back of her neck that every prey animal knows instinctively. She reached for her shotgun, kept loaded by the door, standard practice this far from help, and chambered around as quietly as she could. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent cabin. Then a shadow moved past her window. Sarah's breath caught. The shadow was tall, very tall. It moved with the same deliberate care she'd seen 3 days ago. She stood frozen, shotgun raised but not aimed at anything specific. Her heart hammered. Were they back? Had she done something wrong? Offended them somehow? A knock at her door made her jump. Not a pounding, just 3 deliberate taps. Holy shit, they were knocking. Sarah approached the door slowly, shotgun still in hand. Who's there? No answer, just silence. I know you're out there, she said louder. What do you want? Another 3 knocks. Patient, waiting. Sarah's mind raced. The tribe had been peaceful before. They'd left peacefully, but that didn't mean they couldn't be dangerous. Still, if they wanted to hurt her, they wouldn't be knocking. They'd just come through the door. She took a breath, set the shotgun aside, but within reach, and opened the door. The leader stood on her porch. Jesus, he was even bigger than she remembered. His massive frame filled her entire doorway, his head nearly touching the porch roof. He was alone this time. No tribe behind him, just him, standing in the darkness, steam rising from his body in the cold air. They stared at each other for a long moment. Sarah's hand stayed on the door frame, ready to slam it shut if needed. But the leader made no aggressive moves. He just stood there, those intelligent eyes studying her face. Then he did something that made Sarah's knees go weak. He stepped back and gestured toward the woods. The motion was unmistakable. Come with me. You want me to follow you? Sarah's voice came out higher than she intended. The leader nodded, actually nodded again. Then he made that low rumbling sound in his chest and gestured once more. Every instinct Sarah had screamed danger. Going into the woods at night with a massive creature that could kill her without breaking a sweat was possibly the stupidest thing she could do. Marcus's story about the disappeared researcher echoed in her mind, but there was something in the leader's eyes. Not threat, invitation. Give me a minute, Sarah said. She grabbed her heavy coat, her warmest boots, and a flashlight. The shotgun stayed behind. If this went badly, it wouldn't help anyway. Before leaving, she scratched a quick note and left it on her kitchen table. Went into woods with visitor. If I'm not back by morning, call Sheriff Thompson and tell him to search northwest of my cabin. It was something, at least, evidence of where she'd gone. Sarah stepped onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind her. The leader waited patiently, then turned and began walking toward the tree line. Sarah followed, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. They walked in silence. The leader moved with surprising grace for something so massive, barely making a sound, despite the snow. Sarah, by contrast, crunched and crashed through drifts, breathing hard to keep up with his long stride. After about 10 minutes, they reached a section of forest Sarah didn't recognize. The trees were older here, bigger, with trunks so wide 3 people couldn't circle them with linked arms. The leader stopped at the base of one particularly massive cedar and gestured upward. Sarah followed his gaze and gasped. There, built into the branches about 20 feet up, was a structure. Not a nest too deliberate for that. It was a platform, maybe 15 feet across, woven from branches and covered with what looked like moss and pine needles. A dwelling, and there were more. Looking around, Sarah counted at least 7 similar structures in the surrounding trees. A village, a hidden village in the canopy. The leader made a sound not to Sarah, but to the trees above. Within seconds, shapes appeared. The tribe. They climbed down from their homes with easy confidence, dropping the last several feet to land silently in the snow. Sarah counted 12 adults, all watching her with those same intelligent, curious eyes. And 3 juveniles, teenagers, maybe who hung back but craned their necks to see the human visitor. The 2 females from before appeared, each holding one of the infants Sarah had rescued. The little ones had grown noticeably in just 3 days, their fur thicker, their movements stronger. When they saw Sarah, they made excited sounds and reached for her. The female holding the larger infant approached Sarah slowly. She bent down, still towering over Sarah even while crouching, and held out the infant. "Oh, I don't," Sarah started, but the infant was already launching itself at her, tiny hands grabbing her coat. Sarah caught it instinctively, and the little creature buried its face in her neck, making happy chirping sounds. The tribe watched this interaction with what Sarah could only describe as approval. The leader made a low sound, and one of the other adults stepped forward. This one was older, its fur graying around the face and hands. It carried something, a bundle wrapped in bark and tied with plant fibers. It approached Sarah and held out the bundle. When Sarah hesitated, the elder made an encouraging sound and pushed it into her hands. Sarah unwrapped it carefully. Inside were seeds, dozens of them, varieties she didn't immediately recognize, and roots, dried and preserved, and something else small, carved figurines of animals. A deer, a bear, an owl, gifts. They were giving her gifts. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. The leader stepped closer. He reached out. Sarah held perfectly still and placed one massive hand gently on her shoulder. The touch was careful, controlled. Then he gestured to the infant, still clinging to Sarah, then to the other members of the tribe, then back to Sarah. The meaning was clear. "You saved our children. You are family now." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you for showing me this." The leader's expression, as much as she could read it, seemed almost pleased. He made another sound, and the tribe began to disperse, climbing back into their tree dwellings with that same easy grace. The female took the infant back from Sarah, but gently, with what looked like a smile. Within minutes, Sarah was alone in the clearing with just the leader. He gestured back the way they'd come. Time to go home. The walk back was quieter than the walk there. Sarah clutched her bundle of gifts, her mind racing with everything she'd just witnessed. A whole community, a civilization, hidden in the trees. How long had they been here? How many more settlements like this existed in the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest? The leader brought her right to the edge of her clearing, then stopped. He turned to face her one last time, his eyes meeting hers in the darkness. Then he did something Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. He spoke, not in English, not in any human language, but he made sounds that were clearly words, clearly language. A full sentence, maybe 2, in that deep rumbling voice. The intonation suggested a statement, maybe gratitude, maybe a promise. Sarah stared at him, stunned. "I wish I could understand you." The leader tilted his head, considering. Then he reached out and touched his chest with one hand, then pointed at Sarah's chest with one finger. The gesture was universal. "We are connected now." Then he turned and melted into the forest, leaving Sarah alone in her clearing with a bundle of gifts and a head full of impossible experiences. She walked back to her cabin in a daze, went inside, and tore up the note she'd left on the table. She unpacked the bundle carefully, laying out the seeds and roots and figurines on her kitchen table, evidence that she hadn't imagined any of it. Sarah sat in her rocking chair and stared at the fire for a long time. She'd been invited into one of the greatest secrets on Earth. She She'd been shown trust by a species that had every reason to fear and hate humans, and she'd been given gifts, both physical and intangible, that she could never repay. But with those gifts came responsibility. The tribe had shown themselves to her. They'd made themselves vulnerable, and Sarah understood, as clearly as if someone had spelled it out, that she was now their protector, their secret keeper. It was a heavy weight, but looking at the carefully carved figurines on her table, feeling the memory of the infant's tiny hands clutching her coat, Sarah found she didn't mind the burden. Some secrets were worth keeping. Some mysteries were meant to stay mysterious, and some connections, once made, lasted a lifetime. Sarah didn't sleep that night either. She sat in her rocking chair with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the fire burn down to embers, then building it back up again. Her mind wouldn't shut off. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those tree dwellings, the careful way the tribe had climbed down to meet her, the gifts they'd given her, the fact that they had language, actual, structured language. By morning, she'd made a decision. She needed to know more. Not to expose them, never that, but to understand what she was protecting, who she was protecting. The county library in Cascade Ridge was small, just 2 rooms in the basement of the community center, run by a volunteer named Ashley Cooper, who was maybe 30 years old and treated the collection like it was the Library of Congress. Sarah drove down the mountain around 10 a.m. after the plows had made their morning run. Ashley looked up from her computer when Sarah walked in. "Sarah Mitchell, twice in 1 week. Should I be worried? Need to do some research," Sarah said. "You got anything on local history? Specifically Native American history in this area? We've got a section." Ashley led her to a corner shelf that held maybe 20 books, all of them old enough that their pages had yellowed. "Looking for anything specific? Stories, legends, anything about the creatures that supposedly lived in these mountains before settlers showed up?" Ashley's eyebrows rose. "You too? What is it with everyone suddenly interested in Bigfoot? Jake Henderson was in here last week, asking the same thing." Sarah's stomach tightened. Jake was researching this. "Yeah," said his crew had been spooked by something in the woods. Wanted to know if there were any historical sightings in the area. Ashley pulled a book from the shelf. "This one's probably your best bet. It's a collection of oral histories from the Cascade tribes, compiled by a researcher in the 70s. Sarah took the book. "Thanks. Fair warning, it's pretty dry. Academic writing, lots of footnotes. But there's a whole chapter on what the locals called the mountain people. Apparently, the tribes around here believed they shared the forest with another intelligent species, had specific protocols for avoiding conflict with them." "What kind of protocols?" "Leave offerings at certain locations. Don't hunt in specific areas during certain seasons. Make noise when traveling so you don't surprise them. That kind of thing." Ashley leaned against the shelf. The researcher's theory was that it was all metaphorical, the mountain people representing the dangers of the wilderness, the need to respect nature, etc. But the tribes didn't think it was metaphorical. Nope. According to the interviews, they were dead serious. Talked about the mountain people like they were neighbors. Dangerous neighbors you had to be careful around, but neighbors nonetheless. Ashley studied Sarah's face. "You okay? You look like you haven't slept." "Rough couple of nights," Sarah admitted. "Can I check this out?" "Sure. Just bring it back whenever." Sarah spent the rest of the day in her cabin, reading. The book was exactly as Ashley described, dry, academic, full of citations and analysis. But beneath the scholarly language was something fascinating. The Cascade tribes had names for the mountain people. Different names depending on the specific tribe, but the descriptions were consistent. Large, hair-covered beings that walked on 2 legs, intelligent, capable of language, mostly peaceful, but dangerous if provoked, or if their young were threatened. The tribes had considered them people, not animals, not spirits, but people, different from humans, yes, but deserving of the same basic respect and caution you'd give any neighboring community. There were protocols for interaction. If you encountered one of the mountain people, You stayed calm. You didn't run. You made yourself small and non-threatening. You spoke to them in low tones, even if they couldn't understand your words. The tone mattered more than the content. If you found evidence of their presence, tracks, broken branches, stripped bark, you moved on quickly and quietly. You didn't investigate. You didn't try to follow. And under absolutely no circumstances did you approach their young. Sarah read that last part 3 times. The book cited multiple tribal sources stating that the mountain people were fiercely protective of their children. Any perceived threat to an infant or juvenile would result in immediate and violent retaliation. Yet the tribe had let Sarah take their infants inside, had waited patiently outside her cabin instead of tearing through the walls, had given her gifts afterward. Why? Sarah closed the book and stared at the branch on her mantle. Maybe it was because she'd acted without hesitation. She'd seen infants in distress and helped them, no questions asked. No attempt to capture them or document them or use them for her own purposes. Just pure, instinctive care. Or maybe it was because she lived alone, because she'd spent 8 years in these mountains, keeping to herself, respecting the forest, taking only what she needed. Maybe the tribe had been watching her all that time. Maybe they decided, somehow, that she was safe. The thought that she might have been observed for years without knowing it should have been terrifying. But instead, Sarah found it oddly comforting. She wasn't alone up here. She'd never been alone. Over the next week, Sarah fell into a new routine. She did her usual chores, wood chopping, cabin maintenance, the endless work of mountain living. But every evening, just after sunset, she would take the bundle of seeds the tribe had given her and plant a few in small pots on her windowsill. She had no idea what they were, but she was curious to see what would grow. And every night, before bed, she would step onto her porch and listen to the forest. Sometimes she heard nothing but wind and the occasional owl. But other times, she heard things that didn't quite fit the normal patterns. Low calls in the distance. Movement through the trees that was too controlled, too purposeful to be wild animals. She was hearing the tribe, and now that she knew what to listen for, she realized they'd been there all along. On the 8th night after her visit to the village, Sarah heard something different. A sound that made her blood run cold. Gunshots. 3 of them, rapid fire, coming from the northwest. Maybe 2 miles away, in the direction of Jake Henderson's logging operation. Sarah was inside and on the phone to the sheriff's office within 30 seconds. Sheriff Thompson. Marcus, it's Sarah Mitchell. I just heard gunshots up by the north section. 3 shots. Could be hunters. At 9 p.m. in February. Sarah's voice was sharp. Something's wrong. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I'll head up there. Stay in your cabin, Sarah. Marcus, if Jake and his crew are messing around in those woods, stay in your cabin. Marcus's tone left no room for argument. I'll call you when I know something. The line went dead. Sarah paced her cabin for 2 hours, her anxiety building with each passing minute. She kept stepping onto the porch, listening for more shots, but heard nothing except the usual night sounds. Finally, at 11:15, her phone rang. Sarah, it's Marcus. His voice sounded tired. We've got a situation. What happened? Jake's crew was doing some night work. They've got deadlines on a contract, been running late shifts. Around 9 p.m., one of the guys says he saw something moving in the trees. Something big. He fired 3 warning shots. Sarah's stomach dropped. Oh no, the crew is spooked as hell. 2 of them quit on the spot. Jake wants me to increase patrols in the area, says his men won't work unless they feel safe. Marcus, listen to me very carefully. You need to shut down that logging operation, at least temporarily. Tell Jake to pull his crews back. On what grounds? That Bigfoot might be real. Marcus's tone was skeptical. Sarah, I can't shut down a legitimate business operation because of some tracks and one spooked logger. Those weren't warning shots, Sarah said quietly. That was someone shooting at something real. And if they hit it, if they hurt one of them, one of what, Sarah? Marcus's voice had gone very quiet. What exactly are you telling me? Sarah closed her eyes. This was the moment. She could tell him everything about the infants, the tribe, the village in the trees, or she could keep the secret and hope that would be enough to protect them. I'm telling you that Jake needs to move his operation. There are things in those woods that don't want to be disturbed, and if he keeps pushing, people are going to get hurt. You've seen them. It wasn't a question. Yes. Marcus was silent for a long time. Jesus, Sarah, I was hoping you'd tell me I was crazy. That Jake was crazy, but you've actually seen them. They're real, Marcus. They're intelligent, and they have families, and they've lived in these mountains a hell of a lot longer than we have. And now Jake's crew is shooting at them. Did they hit anything? I don't know, but if they did, Sarah didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I'll talk to Jake, Marcus said finally. Try to convince him to move his operation. But Sarah, I can't tell him why. You understand that? I can't tell anyone why. I understand. And Sarah? Be careful. If there's going to be retaliation. He trailed off. I know. After Marcus hung up, Sarah stood on her porch and stared into the darkness. The forest was completely silent. No calls, no movement, nothing. That silence scared her more than any sound could have. She went back inside, loaded her shotgun not to use, just to have nearby, and tried to sleep. But every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made her jump. She kept thinking about the researcher who'd disappeared in '98. About tribal warnings of what happened when the mountain people were threatened. Morning came with fog so thick, Sarah couldn't see past her porch railing. She made coffee and was trying to decide whether to risk the drive down the mountain when she heard vehicles approaching. Multiple vehicles. Sarah grabbed her coat and stepped outside. 3 trucks emerged from the fog, Jake Henderson's work vehicles. They pulled up in front of her cabin, and Jake got out, followed by 4 of his crew members. The men looked exhausted and on edge. Sarah, Jake called out. We need to talk. What's going on? Pack your things. You're coming down to town with us. Excuse me? Jake climbed her porch steps, his expression grim. Look, I know you're independent and you like your privacy, but something is very wrong in these woods. My guys found tracks this morning, dozens of them, all around our work site, and they're fresh made during the night after the shooting. Sarah's chest tightened. What kind of tracks? The kind that shouldn't exist. Jake lowered his voice. Sarah, I think they were watching us. All night, just standing there in the trees, watching. My guys are terrified. Hell, I'm terrified. And you're up here alone, 2 miles from anyone else. I'm not leaving my home because of some tracks, Jake. It's not safe. I'll be fine. Damn it. Sarah. Jake stopped, took a breath. Look, just come down to town for a few days. Stay at the motel. Let whatever this is settle down. And then what? You go back to logging? Keep disturbing their territory? Jake's eyes narrowed. Their territory? Sarah, what do you know about this? I know that you need to move your operation. Find another section to log. Leave the north area alone. We've got a contract. Specific coordinates. I can't just move. Then break the contract, Sarah said flatly. Because if you keep pushing into that area, people are going to die. Possibly you. Possibly your crew. And I don't want that blood on my hands for not warning you. One of Jake's crew members, a younger guy, maybe 25 years old, stepped forward. You've seen them, haven't you? The things in the woods. Sarah looked at him. His name was Tyler, something she'd seen him around town but never really talked to him. He looked scared, but also curious, desperate for answers. Yes, Sarah said simply. What are they? They're exactly what you think they are. And they're not animals. They're people. Different from us, but people. With families and homes, and a right to exist without being shot at. Jake ran his hand through his hair. You're telling me Bigfoot is real? Multiple Bigfoot. Living right here. I'm telling you that you and your crew stumbled into territory that doesn't belong to humans. And the residents aren't happy about it. Jesus Christ. Jake turned to his crew. "You guys hearing this?" "I told you, man," Tyler said. "I told you those tracks weren't natural." Another crew member, Marcus, had called him. Derek spoke up. "So what do? We can't just abandon the job." "Yes, you can," Sarah said. "Or you can finish what you've already started and then never go back to that section. But you can't keep expanding further north. That's not negotiable." "Says who?" Derek's tone was challenging. "Says the tribe that's been watching you for the past week. The same tribe that surrounded your work site last night, with enough numbers to overrun you in about 30 seconds if they'd wanted to." Sarah let that sink in. "They're showing restraint. Don't mistake that for weakness." The crew exchanged glances. Tyler looked like he might be sick. Jake just looked tired. "I need to talk to the contractor," Jake said finally. "Try to renegotiate the boundaries." "But Sarah, I'm serious about you coming to town. If they're as intelligent as you're saying, and if they're pissed off, you're isolated up here." "They won't hurt me," Sarah said, with more confidence than she felt. "How do you know?" "Because I've already met them, and they made it clear I'm not the problem." Sarah looked at each of the crew members. "But you need to understand something. These beings have lived here for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. They've watched humans move into their territory, cut down their forests, destroy their habitat. They've shown remarkable patience. But patience has limits." "What do they want?" Tyler asked quietly. "Same thing you want. To be left alone. To raise their families in peace. To live without constantly being threatened, or hunted, or treated like animals." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll move the operation. It'll cost me hell. It might cost me the whole contract. But I'll move it." "Thank you," Sarah said. "Don't thank me yet. I've still got to convince the contractor, and he's not going to be happy." Jake headed back to his truck. "And Sarah, if something happens up here, if you need help, you call me. Day or night. You understand?" "I understand." The trucks pulled away, disappearing back into the fog. Sarah stood on her porch for a long time, listening to the forest. Still silent, still waiting. She hoped Jake could keep his promise, because if he couldn't, if the logging continued, she had no idea what the tribe would do, and she had a terrible feeling she might be caught in the middle. 3 days passed without incident. The fog lifted. The temperature dropped to single digits. Sarah split wood, checked her traps for rabbits, and tried to maintain her normal routine. But normal felt impossible now. She kept one ear always tuned to the forest, listening for signs of the tribe or signs of trouble. On the third night, she got both. It started around midnight. Sarah was dozing in her chair. She'd been sleeping there more often than in her bed, unable to shake the feeling that she needed to be ready for something, when a sound jerked her awake. Voices. Human voices. Multiple people, moving through the forest maybe half a mile away. And they were being loud, crashing through the underbrush with no attempt at stealth. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and went to the window. She couldn't see anything through the darkness, but she could hear them getting closer. Male voices, laughing. The unmistakable slur of people who'd been drinking. "Oh hell," Sarah muttered. She recognized one of the voices. Derek from Jake's crew. The one who'd challenged her 3 days ago. They were hunting. Sarah realized it with a sick certainty. Derek and his buddies had decided to come up here at night, probably drunk on liquid courage, and hunt for the tribe. This was bad. This was really bad. Sarah grabbed her phone and called Marcus, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried Jake's number. Same thing. The town was 12 miles away, and by the time anyone got up here, it would be too late. The voices were closer now, maybe a quarter mile. Sarah could make out words, saw the tracks right around here. "If we get a picture, we'll be famous. Just want to see one up close." Idiots. Drunk. Stupid idiots who had no idea what they were walking into. Sarah made a decision. She grabbed her heaviest coat, her flashlight, and after a moment's hesitation, her shotgun. Not to shoot anyone, just to have. She headed out into the darkness. The cold was brutal, stealing her breath. But Sarah pushed forward, following the sounds of the voices. They weren't hard to track. Derek and his friends were making enough noise to wake the dead. She found them maybe 10 minutes later, in a small clearing. 3 men, all in their 20s or early 30s. Derek, plus 2 guys Sarah didn't recognize. They had flashlights, cameras, and her stomach-dropped rifles. "Derek!" Sarah's voice cut across the clearing. All 3 men spun, their lights blinding her. "What the hell?" Derek lowered his flashlight. "Sarah, what are you doing out here?" What are you doing out here?" Sarah moved closer, her anger overriding her fear. "Do you have any idea how stupid this is?" "We're just looking around," one of the other men said. His words were definitely slurred. "Gonna get some evidence, prove they exist. And then what? You think you're going to be heroes? Get famous?" Sarah looked at their rifles. "Or were you planning to shoot one?" "Just for protection," Derek said, but his eyes slid away. "Protection." Sarah's voice was flat. "You came onto their territory, drunk, armed, making enough noise to wake the entire mountain, and you think you're the ones who need protection? Look, lady, we've got a right to be here. This is public land. That doesn't make you safe." "From what? Some overgrown ape?" The third man laughed. "Come on, even if they exist, what are they gonna do? It's 3 armed men against—" He didn't finish the sentence, because that's when the first shadow moved at the edge of the clearing, then another, and another. Within seconds, the clearing was surrounded. Sarah counted at least 8 of them, maybe more. They'd moved in absolute silence, materializing from the darkness like ghosts. Their eyes reflected the flashlight beams, giving them an otherworldly appearance. The 3 men froze. "Oh shit," Derek whispered. "Oh shit, oh shit." "Don't move," Sarah said quietly. "Don't run. Don't raise those rifles. Just stay completely still. There's so many," one of the men whimpered. Sarah took a slow step forward, putting herself between the men and the tribe. It was probably pointless. If the tribe wanted to get to Derek and his friends, Sarah couldn't stop them. But she had to try. The leader emerged from the shadows. He was even more imposing in this context, his massive frame backlit by the men's flashlights. He looked at Sarah first, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze moved to the 3 hunters. The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 10 degrees. "They're drunk," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm and low. "They're stupid, and they're drunk, and they don't understand. But they're leaving, right now, aren't you?" She looked back at Derek and his friends. All 3 men were pale, shaking. One had wet himself. Their rifles were lowered, forgotten. "We're leaving," Derek managed. "We're leaving right now." "Put the rifles down first," Sarah said, slowly. "Put them on the ground and step away." "What?" "No, now." The tone in her voice left no room for argument. Derek and his friends lowered their rifles to the ground with shaking hands and stepped back. The leader watched this with those intelligent eyes. He made a low sound, and 2 other tribe members moved forward. They picked up the rifles. The weapons looked almost comically small in their massive hands, and examined them briefly before snapping the barrels like twigs. The crack of breaking metal echoed through the clearing. "Jesus Christ," one of the men sobbed. The leader gestured toward the south. The meaning was clear. Leave. Now. Derek and his friends didn't need to be told twice. They ran, crashing through the underbrush, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they fled. Within seconds, their sounds had faded into the distance. Sarah stood alone in the clearing with the tribe, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The leader approached her slowly. He stopped about 6 feet away and studied her face. Then he made a sound, not angry, almost questioning. "They won't come back," Sarah said. "I'll make sure of it. And Jake's moving his logging operation. It might take a few days, but he's moving it." The leader tilted his head, considering. Then he reached into a pouch. Sarah hadn't noticed it before, woven from plant fibers and hanging at his side, and pulled something out. A root, thick and gnarled. He held it out to her. Sarah took it carefully. It was heavy, solid. She had no idea what it was or what it meant. The leader touched his chest, then pointed at Sarah. The same gesture from before. We are connected. Then he made a sound that the others responded to immediately. The tribe melted back into the forest, leaving Sarah alone in the clearing with a broken rifle, a strange route, and her hands still shaking from adrenaline. She walked back to her cabin in a daze. It was after 2 a.m. by the time she got inside, locked the door, and collapsed into her chair. She sat there until dawn, staring at the root in her hands, thinking about how close things had come to violence. How close those 3 drunk idiots had come to starting a war they couldn't possibly win. When the sun finally came up, Sarah called Marcus. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice groggy. "Sarah, it's 6 in the morning. Derek Carson and 2 of his friends went into the woods last night, armed, hunting for the tribe." Silence. Then, "Tell me, they're okay. They're alive, scared shitless, but alive. The tribe let them go, but Marcus, this is going to keep happening. People are going to keep coming up here looking for them, and eventually, someone's going to get killed. What do you want me to do, Sarah? I can't post deputies on every trail in the mountains. I don't know, but we need to figure something out. Because what happened last night? That was a warning. Next time might not end so peacefully." Marcus sighed heavily. "I'll talk to Derek, press charges if I have to. Public endangerment, illegal hunting at night, something. Try to make an example. It won't be enough, I know, but it's all I've got." After she hung up, Sarah looked at the seeds growing on her windowsill. They'd started to sprout tiny green shoots pushing up through the soil. She didn't know what they'd become, but she'd take care of them anyway. Just like she'd try to take care of the tribe, even if she had no idea how. The next 2 weeks were tense. Word spread through Cascade Ridge about Derek's encounter. The details got wilder with each retelling 20. Bigfoot, 50, 100. Creatures 10 feet tall with glowing eyes, and the ability to vanish into thin air. Tourist traffic increased as cryptid enthusiasts started showing up with cameras and equipment. Marcus had to hire 2 temporary deputies just to manage the influx and patrol the trailheads. He arrested 4 people for trespassing and gave warnings to at least a dozen more. The town, which usually saw maybe 50 visitors a month in winter, suddenly had hundreds. Jake kept his promise and moved his logging operation, but not everyone was happy about it. The contractor threatened to sue. The crew lost 3 weeks of work, and rumors started circulating that Jake had moved because he was scared, which hurt his reputation in an industry built on toughness. Sarah stayed on her mountain and watched it all unfold with growing anxiety. The tribe had gone silent. She didn't hear them at night anymore. Didn't see any signs of their presence. It was like they'd vanished completely. That worried her more than anything, because it probably meant they were preparing for something. On a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after Derek's hunting trip, Sarah drove down to Peterson's General for supplies. The store was packed with tourists buying maps and trail guides and expensive hiking gear they probably didn't know how to use. Emma looked harassed behind the register. Sarah, thank God. A familiar face. Busy day? Busy month. We've had more business in 3 weeks than we usually see in 3 months. I should be happy, I guess. But Emma lowered her voice. These people don't respect the forest. They leave trash everywhere, ignore trail closures, wander off marked paths. Someone's going to get hurt. Someone already got hurt, Sarah said. They just don't know it yet. Emma looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Before Sarah could answer, the door opened and a woman walked in. Late 30s, professional looking, with expensive outdoor gear and a confident stride. She went straight to Emma. Excuse me, I'm looking for someone who knows the area well. I'm doing research on reported sightings of cryptids in the Cascade Range, specifically. No, Emma interrupted. The woman blinked. I'm sorry. No, I'm not helping you find them. Nobody in this town is going to help you find them. I don't think you understand. I'm Dr. Rachel Hayes from Portland State University. I'm a primatologist, and if there's even a chance that an undiscovered species of great ape is living in these mountains. There's no chance, Emma said firmly. It's just stories, tourist nonsense. Now if you're going to buy something, go ahead. Otherwise, I've got actual customers to help. Dr. Hayes's expression hardened. I've heard about the incidents. The logging crew, the hunters. I've seen photographs of the tracks. Something is out there, and I intend to document it. Sarah felt ice in her stomach. This was different from drunk hunters or curious tourists. This was a scientist, someone who would be systematic, persistent, dangerous. You should leave, Sarah heard herself say. Dr. Hayes turned to her. And you are? Someone who's lived in these mountains for 8 years. Someone who knows that poking around where you're not welcome gets people killed. Is that a threat? It's a fact. You want to do research? Fine. But do it somewhere else. Not here. I have the right to be here. This is public land. The researcher who came here in '98 had the right to be here too, Sarah said quietly. She disappeared. They never found her body. That's what happens when you go looking for things that don't want to be found. Something flickered in Dr. Hayes's eyes. Uncertainty, maybe. But it was quickly replaced by determination. I'm not some amateur enthusiast. I'm a trained scientist with proper equipment and protocols. I'll be fine. You really won't, Sarah said. Dr. Hayes purchased a trail map and left. Emma and Sarah watched her go in silence. This is bad, Emma said finally. Yeah, what do we do? I have absolutely no idea. Sarah drove back to her cabin with her supplies, but her mind was racing. Dr. Hayes was going to go into the woods. She was going to look for the tribe, probably using systematic search patterns and scientific methodology. And she wasn't going to give up after one failed attempt, which meant the tribe would either have to reveal themselves, move their settlement, or eliminate the threat. Sarah couldn't let any of those options happen. That night, she did something she'd never done before. She walked out to the edge of her clearing, right where it met the tree line, and she called out, I know you're out there. I know you're listening. I need to talk to someone. Please. Silence. Just the wind through the trees. Sarah tried again. There's a woman, a researcher. She's going to come looking for you. She's smart, and she's persistent, and she's not going to stop. I'm trying to protect you, but I need help. Please. More silence. Sarah was about to give up when she heard movement in the trees. The elder appeared, the one with the grey fur, who'd given her the bundle of gifts. It approached slowly, stopping about 15 feet away. In the moonlight, its face looked ancient and wise. Thank you for coming, Sarah said. I don't know if you understand me, but I'm going to try anyway. The elder tilted its head, listening. Sarah explained about Dr. Hayes, about her credentials and her determination, about how she represented a different kind of threat than drunk hunters or curious tourists. If she finds you, she'll tell others. Scientists, universities, the government. They'll all come. Your life here will be over. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. I don't want that to happen, but I don't know how to stop her. The elder watched her for a long moment. Then it did something surprising. It gestured for Sarah to follow and began walking into the forest. Sarah hesitated only a second before following. They walked for maybe 20 minutes, deeper into the mountains than Sarah had gone before. The path was barely visible, clearly not a human trail. They crossed a creek, climbed a steep embankment, and finally emerged into a clearing Sarah had never seen. It was beautiful, a natural amphitheater surrounded by ancient trees, with a small pool fed by a waterfall at one end, and gathered around the pool were members of the tribe, at least 30 of them, including the infants Sarah had rescued, now noticeably bigger and more active. They were having what looked like a meeting. The leader stood at the center, making sound speech. Sarah realized, actual structured speech, while the others listened and occasionally responded. The elder led Sarah to the edge of the gathering. Every eye turned to her, but nobody moved aggressively. The leader acknowledged her with a nod, then continued his speech. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she could read the tone. Concerned, urgent. He was talking about the threats they faced, about humans encroaching on their territory, about the need to make a decision. Other members of the tribe spoke up. Some made aggressive gestures, suggesting fight. Others seemed to advocate for retreat, moving deeper into the mountains. The debate went on for almost an hour while Sarah stood at the edge, watching this impossible scene unfold. Finally, the leader made a sound that seemed to signal conclusion. Then he turned to Sarah and gestured for her to approach. Sarah walked forward on shaky legs. The leader studied her face, then made a series of sounds. He pointed to the mountains to the east, then made a sweeping motion. Then he pointed to Sarah, then to the west, where her cabin lay, and made a different gesture, a holding motion. Sarah understood. They were going to move. Not because they were afraid, but because staying would mean constant conflict. They would relocate their settlement deeper into the wilderness, to places humans rarely ventured. But Sarah was to stay, to be their eyes and ears in the human world, to warn them if danger approached. "I'll do it," Sarah said. "I'll watch out for you, I promise." The leader nodded. Then he did something that made Sarah's eyes burn with tears. He placed his massive hand on top of her head gently, carefully in a gesture that looked exactly like a blessing. The tribe began to disperse, heading off in different directions to prepare for the move. The elder stayed with Sarah, guiding her back toward her cabin. When they reached the edge of her clearing, the elder stopped. It reached into its pouch and pulled out one more gift, a necklace made from braided plant fibers, with a single carved wooden pendant. The pendant was shaped like a human hand and creature hand, overlapped, fingers intertwined. The elder placed it in Sarah's palm and closed her fingers around it. Then it made a sound soft, rumbling, almost affectionate, and touched its hand to Sarah's chest, right over her heart. "Family," the gesture said. "You are family." Then the elder disappeared into the forest, leaving Sarah alone with tears streaming down her face and a necklace clutched in her hand. The next morning, Sarah drove to the motel where Dr. Hayes was staying. She found the researcher having coffee in the small dining area, surrounded by maps and notebooks. "Dr. Hayes, can I talk to you?" The researcher looked up, recognition dawning. "You're the woman from the store. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I need to tell you something." Sarah sat down uninvited. "I've lived in these mountains for 8 years. I came here after my daughter died, looking for peace and isolation. I found both, but I also found something else." Dr. Hayes leaned forward, interest sharp in her eyes. "What I'm about to tell you can never be repeated, can never be documented, can never appear in any research, paper, or journal article. Do you understand? I can't agree to that without. Then this conversation is over." Sarah started to stand. "Wait." Dr. Hayes studied her face. "You've seen them." "Yes. Multiple individuals? A whole community. And you're asking me to walk away from potentially the most significant zoological discovery in a century? It wasn't a question. I'm asking you to consider why they've remained undiscovered for so long. It's not luck, Dr. Hayes. It's choice. They're intelligent. They have language, culture, social structures. They're not animals to be studied. They're people, and they've chosen to live apart from humans for very good reasons. You can't possibly ask me to." "They're moving," Sarah interrupted. "Because of the attention, because of researchers like you and hunters, and tourists with cameras. They're leaving territory they've probably occupied for generations, heading deeper into the wilderness where humans rarely go. And it's my fault for not keeping their secret better." Dr. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. "If I agree to walk away, can I at least ask questions?" "Off the record," Sarah considered. "A few. How many?" "In this area, maybe 40. But there are other communities, other settlements scattered throughout the wilderness. Communication? Complex language. I can't understand it, but it's clearly structured speech. Social organization? Family groups. Tribal structure with clear leadership. They care for their young, create art, have protocols and traditions. Sarah pulled the necklace from her pocket and showed it to Dr. Hayes. They gave me this as a symbol of trust. Dr. Hayes stared at the pendant, her hands trembling slightly. This is... Sarah, do you understand what you're showing me? I understand that it needs to stay between us. I'm a scientist. My entire career will be exactly the same whether you find them or not. But their lives, their entire civilization will be destroyed if you do. Sarah leaned forward. You became a primatologist because you care about great apes, right? You want to protect them, study them, help preserve their populations. Of course. Then protect these people by leaving them alone, by letting them remain a mystery, because the minute you confirm their existence, they'll become specimens, property, resources to be exploited. You know I'm right, Doctor. Hayes looked at the necklace for a long time. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. In the 70s, there was a primatologist named Diane Fossey. She studied mountain gorillas in Rwanda. I've heard of her. She fought against poachers, against tourism, against anyone who threatened her gorillas. She became so protective that some considered her radical, dangerous. Dr. Hayes met Sarah's eyes. She was murdered in 1985, probably by the same poachers she'd been fighting against. But before she died, she saved an entire species from extinction by teaching the world to see gorillas as individuals, as beings deserving of protection and respect. Sarah waited. I became a primatologist because of Fossey, because she showed that scientific study and deep respect could coexist. But you're asking me to do something she never did, to walk away from a discovery that could change everything we understand about primate evolution and intelligence. I'm asking you to consider that maybe the best way to protect them is to pretend they don't exist. Dr. Hayes closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were wet. I hate that you're right. You'll leave? I'll leave. I'll report that my preliminary survey found no credible evidence. I'll recommend that future research focus on other areas. She looked at the necklace one more time. But Sarah, promise me something. What? If things change, if they're ever in danger and need someone to speak for them, someone with scientific credibility, you'll find me. I promise. Dr. Hayes left Cascade Ridge that afternoon. Within a week, the tourist traffic had died down. Within a month, things were mostly back to normal. Jake's crew finished their modified contract and moved on to a different section of forest. The temporary deputies went back to wherever they'd come from. Life returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Sarah stayed on her mountain, watching, listening. The tribe had moved, but she occasionally found signs that they hadn't gone far. A branch arranged in a specific pattern near her woodpile, a cairn of stones that appeared overnight by her trail. Small reminders that they were still close, still connected. The seeds on her windowsill grew into plants she'd never seen before, some kind of herb with silver-green leaves and a smell like sage and cedar combined. Sarah dried the leaves and burned them in her fire sometimes, filling the cabin with their scent. The necklace never left her neck, and on nights when the moon was full and the forest was quiet, Sarah would sometimes hear singing in the distance. Not quite human, not quite animal, something in between. The sound of a people celebrating their survival, their freedom, their continued existence in a world that wanted to prove they couldn't exist. Sarah would smile on those nights and add wood to her fire, content in the knowledge that some mysteries were worth keeping, some secrets were worth protecting, and some connections, once made, lasted forever. Marcus visited her cabin one last time before spring thaw, bringing supplies and news from town. Dr. Hayes published her findings, he said, sipping the terrible coffee Sarah had made, or lack of findings. Said the whole Bigfoot phenomenon in Cascade Ridge was likely a combination of misidentified bear tracks, overactive imaginations, and people seeing what they wanted to see. Smart woman, Sarah said. Derek and his buddies moved to Idaho, said they'd had enough of the mountains. Marcus studied Sarah's face. You know, in the months since this all started, I've been thinking about that researcher who disappeared in '98. What you said about her going looking for something she shouldn't have been looking for. And I'm thinking maybe she found it. Maybe she learned the same lesson you learned, but didn't survive the learning. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Or maybe she survived and chose to disappear. Chose to live with them instead of living with us. Marcus raised his eyebrows. You think that's possible? I think anything is possible in these mountains. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the wind outside. Finally, Marcus stood to leave. Sarah, I know I'm not supposed to know what I know, and I know you're not supposed to tell me what you're not telling me, but thank you for protecting them, for protecting all of us, really. All I did was bring 2 babies in from the cold, and that made all the difference. Marcus headed for the door, then paused. You doing okay up here? Not too lonely? Sarah touched the necklace under her shirt. I'm not alone, Marcus. I haven't been alone in a very long time. After he left, Sarah stood on her porch and looked at the forest. The trees were still bare, but spring was coming. Soon the snow would melt, the trails would open, and summer tourists would flood back into the mountains. But the tribe would be safe, hidden, protected by their own wisdom, and by the few humans who understood that some things were more valuable undiscovered than they ever could be exposed. Sarah Mitchell was 63 years old. She'd lived alone for 8 years, seeking isolation and peace. She'd found both, and so much more. She'd found family in the most unexpected place. She'd found purpose in keeping a secret, and she'd found that the line between human and not human, between civilization and wilderness, between known and unknown, was far thinner than anyone imagined. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the snow gold and orange and pink, Sarah heard it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of the tribe singing, welcoming the coming spring, celebrating survival. Sarah smiled and went back inside her cabin, closing the door gently behind her. The fire was warm, the coffee was terrible, and the seeds on her windowsill were growing strong. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Cascade Range, a civilization that wasn't supposed to exist continued existing, protected by silence, by distance, and by one old woman who understood that the greatest act of love was sometimes just leaving well enough alone. The branch stayed on the mantle, the necklace stayed around her neck, and the secret stayed safe, exactly as it should be.